Turning now to another colleague in the UN system, Michael van Gelderen from OHCHR.
Thank you, Paul, and thanks to the UN Research Institute for Social Development for holding the seminar. It's really great to see the Research Institute addressing the rights of transgender people head-on, and to see more and more UN agencies working on this important topic. I wanted to echo Eustace and just take a little moment to celebrate and honor the incredible work of all the trans human rights defenders that have succeeded against all the odds after many decades of work at the World Health Organization and in organizing that with the reform of the ICD, being trans will no longer be treated as an illness. As Eustace mentioned, it's not for today, but this is a huge milestone, and it's really credit to the work of the trans movement. So I think it's really cause for celebration, for honoring the work of all those that have made this possible. On the topic of today's seminar, I just wanted to address around 6 areas of concern from the human rights perspective. And it very much underpins much of the discussion that we heard from Emily, Sharon's story, and what's happening in humanitarian context, and Eustace highlighting the areas of work under the 2030 Agenda and Sustainable Development Goals. And these are really at the core of what state obligations are under international human rights law for all persons. And where we've seen documented violations of the rights of trans people. So one critical area, and I think that came out, Emily, very much in the story, is all people have a right to be protected from violence. But in many countries, we see a systematic pattern of widespread violence against trans people, including attacks, violence, and murders. And key obligations of states there are around investigation, thorough, prompt investigations, of attacks, taking preventive measures, raising awareness and taking preventive measures, prosecution of perpetrators, and providing remedy and support to victims. The reality is we see multiple reports of lack of access to justice, lack of investigation, and secondary victimization when trans victims try to report crimes to law enforcement. A second critical area is combating torture and ill-treatment in both detention and health settings. All people have a right to be protected from torture and ill-treatment. This is an absolute obligation of states under international human rights law in all contexts. However, there are multiple reports of widespread abuses in detention contexts, ranging from torture of trans people deprived of liberty by other inmates, as well as with the complicity or the direct action of officials. Search procedures that disregard the gender identity of trans people. Placement of trans people that disregards their gender identity as well. Brutal violence. Lack of access to health services, including gender-affirming treatment when in detention. In health settings, health and medical settings, we also see forced treatment, forced diagnosis, sterilization, forced or coerced sterilization, including as requirements for legal recognition, and so-called conversion therapy. A third critical area is around discriminatory laws. So trans people around the world are criminalized under a wide range of different discriminatory laws. Is one group of laws that criminalize so-called cross-dressing. We have at least 8 countries that specifically target trans people on the basis of their gender expression. Many trans people also face arrest under laws that criminalize consensual same-sex conduct. Regardless of their sexual orientation, states target and pursue trans people under these laws. Trans people are also targeted under a range of other vague laws on public morality or laws that criminalize sex work. And together, these sets of laws mean that in more than 70 countries, trans people are at risk of arrest or detention, arbitrary arrest or detention from law enforcement official, or blackmail or harassment on the basis of these laws. And many of these areas you'll see reflected in the areas of the index that were highlighted by Eustace. And so you very much see how the development and human rights world and norms and standards speak to each other. Legal recognition of gender identity without abusive requirements is critical. Without this recognition, it's a huge obstacle to trans people being able to access and realize their fundamental rights. And the norms and standards at international level are very clear. Trans people should have access to such recognition based on self-identification without abusive requirements such as sterilization, medical diagnosis, certification, treatment, or divorce, a process that should be inclusive of non-binary people, and the process should be accessible to children, and safeguards for children should not be discriminatory. The process should ideally be administrative. Now, these are standards that have been established by the UN human rights mechanisms and by our office. Yet, in practice, if you look at the number of countries that meet these standards, it's actually a very small handful of countries. There's already a limited number of countries that have any process at all for legal recognition of gender identity. But the number of countries that meet this human rights standard is actually very reduced. So Malta and Argentina are two countries that do. The reform of outdated medical classification, I think a few people have already referred to the changes happening at the WHO. But the fact is that medical classifications that treat trans people as ill continue to be one of the root causes of violence, discrimination, and lack of access to rights. I think the steps that we have seen yesterday is a fundamental milestone, but I think everyone's aware that we're still many years, possibly many decades away from a reality of a medical system that trans people can access without stigma, without fear of pathologization from health officials. There's a whole need to train health officials and integrate these non-pathologizing classifications in training for medical officials. In combating discrimination, wherever you look, whether it's education, where you see bullying, discrimination, trans people lacking access, being thrown out of schools based on their identity or their gender expression, healthcare, where you see transgender men being denied access to certain health diagnostics or procedures because they are not considered they are considered in one gender or another by the medical system, and the same for trans women or for non-binary persons. Employment, where the ILO has documented widespread discrimination against people based on gender identity or expression. And let's also speak of access to bathrooms, water, and sanitation, where you've seen in many countries people not being able to access such a fundamental human right as access to water and sanitation simply on the basis of their appearance. So what is the landscape? What are the lessons learned at the state level in terms of implementing these standards? I mean, I think that there's both, right? There's room for optimism. We're seeing an increasing number of states making commitments to address these issues, expressing a willingness to engage, and announcing policy reform or legal reforms. But the reality is, if you scan across the world, the panorama is progress is pretty slow. At the highest number of countries that have taken steps is, I think, on prohibiting discrimination. And I think the latest count I saw was that 22 countries prohibit discrimination based on gender identity or expression. That's out of 193 UN member states. So I think that shows, and that's compared to sexual orientation, where we're at around 70 countries, which is still low, but you've seen further progress. So I think, there's positive momentum, there's really important core judgments, but I think we see that there's still a very long way to go and more need than ever to concert efforts and to advance progress and to look at good practices where states are working with civil society to advance and address these issues. Thank you.